All right, guys, welcome back to the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So it's Wednesday, March 16th, and it's about 1800, it's about 6 p.m. So, again, like I've been kind of doing the last few weeks, the information that I'll kind of talk about is as current and as accurate as I can find at the time that I'm making this. But as I've been saying, everything is kind of dependent on internet information and what we can figure out from various reporting sources. It's not a video game. There's no real time feedback on stuff like that. So we're kind of deal with the best that we can here. Um, so talking today, there hasn't been a lot of really kind of large developments. So I was actually kind of thinking about not making a podcast just because there's nothing. Unlike a few of kind of the first days where it was like new city here, new this, new that. There's kind of always something like sort of big to talk about. We kind of nothing that's really substantially new as far as the movement of kind of the general lines in Ukraine. What I did just read, basically, as I was trying to pull up a decent map here to look at, is that there's been multiple explosions reported, or explosions in multiple cities in Belarus reported. So, but then I saw another report that said what sounded like explosion, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But it does sound like potentially there was some sort of strike or launching of large weapons in Belarus that's being reported as explosions as an attack. So that'd be kind of an interesting development if it was a Ukrainian cross-border attack into Belarus, or potentially it is the launching of various supporting arms and things that the country wasn't used to. It's also possible there was you had conscripts handling artillery shells or something and blew themselves up. So we don't really know, but that is something that to kind of keep in mind, that we'll sort of hopefully we'll have some information fleshed out about that here relatively soon. So we'll kind of talk about a little bit about what's going on. So this is kind of the best map I could pull up that kind of shows the general developments as it sits, kind of as of right now. Like I said, no really large territorial changes. Kiev kind of continues to get more and more surrounded. Kharkov is still holding out and is not completely taken over. The Mariupol and places in the south and the southeast remain very heavily fought over. And then in the south by Crimea, so down at Kherson, there was apparently an attack against a Kherson airport down there, and I've seen it reported as an attack by Ukrainian Marines. I've seen it as some form of air related, whether drone or manned fixed wing aircraft attack, or something to that extent. So I don't really know, but I did see a bunch of pictures this morning of several, like numerous helicopters on fire or smoking. Doesn't mean that they're destroyed. Doesn't mean they're not destroyed. Don't really know, but kind of an interesting development there. So we'll kind of, do what I've sort of been doing. I'll just kind of start in the south by Crimea and kind of work my way around counterclockwise here to kind of deal with what we're doing. So if we kind of get an association for where the Russians are kind of currently at, and we'll pop over to our good map of Ukraine itself here. So as we said, so Kherson very heavily fought over, and the Kherson airport is actually, it's a little bit, I might have to pull up here. It's a little bit north and west of the city itself here. Let's see if I can pull it up. Here we go. So Kherson Airport. So it's been pretty well geolocated as far as people posting the pictures. With it's kind of got very like sort of unique looking landing pads here. So fairly readily verified as to the attack that took place. So as we know, the Russians did take over Kherson and relatively control it, and now they're further north and northwest here in Mykolaiv. And so as we said, so basically, so the obvious answer here is that they're trying to control this major highway here, this highway E58 that runs through Kherson. So it comes, so Kherson has major bridges across the Dnieper River here. Then this major highway system coming up into Mykolaiv, and Mykolaiv crosses the Privdeny Bug River here. And so, like we said before, is what makes Mykolaiv important is that it sits on a pretty major road network. So you see a lot of like secondary or reasonably large highways kind of run into it and connect with it, which means that once one controls Mykolaiv, you can kind of choose to go up through Uman and into Ukraine, and into Kiev here. up here along the Dnieper River here. It also means that now you control pretty much all of the best ways to get over to Odessa. And, and then obviously, so Odessa, major port facility, major city, industrial city on the coast of the Black Sea there, which also means that it sits right against Moldova. And so we kind of assume that there's going to be an additional annexing and or attacking into the Transnistria and other areas of Moldova there. Now, I have a friend who has a friend who's in, Kherson or was in Kherson, and made like personal observations that the Ukrainian military resisted very hard there, but that the Ukrainian civilian population didn't really do anything there, which I found to be interesting because it's actually kind of something that, well, him and I were talking at work today about it, but, something I've sort of observed, which is that, Ukraine appears to be fighting very well in general, but, and this could be a lack of video and photographic evidence and just a lack of reporting, but aside from the first few days where there were kind of a lot of sort of like funny videos of people throwing Molotovs at Russian trucks and things and kind of doing drive-by Molotovings and whatever else, there hasn't really been much, if any, sort of partisan-related civilian kind of response, which I guess I'm not really surprised at, but I think it's interesting because it makes one wonder, again, if it's just a lack of reporting, but also, what the actual desire of a people to resist is versus, military. And especially in the modern sense, what you tend to see with very otherwise connected and well-traveled, kind of global, interconnected countries and civilizations and things is that people tend to very quickly lose the, independent and the spirit of resistance. And you tend to see primarily the countries that offer the most individual level, kind of village level resistance tend to be primarily mountain communities, mountain countries. Afghanistan, for example, Dagestan, Chechnya, Georgia, Ossetia, Abkhazia, and then getting down into Armenia and Azerbaijan, places like that, where people tend to be, much less interconnected, which means they're more tribal. It also means that they tend to value the area that they're from and where they live very highly compared to, more modern, more westernized, more interconnected global, countries and civilizations, because when you have so much ease and freedom of movement, civilizations tend, they trend towards, kind of assimilation and away from that hyper independence, that we typically associate with the hyper resistant, partisan guerrilla types of entities of the past. So, it was kind of, so again, kind of continuing on. So we're talking about our Mykolaiv here. So there have been reports of Russian elements, so as we can see here, so this is kind of what the map list is claimed Russian controlled. And the way that I kind of describe these, and I talked about this in my last video, is, I don't know what one uses to designate where we actually control versus where we're just present. And the personal definition that I use is if we only control the singular road or the singular, supply point or access point to something, I don't think you can consider that you control a city or you can control an area, but you can absolutely have units far ahead of what you substantially control, as long as they have, forces, either they actively control the route to supply them, and what we would call the lines of communication, or if they have substantially enough equipment that if they deem it necessary to, traverse again on those lines, they have the ability to. So say, for example, and this is just going to be kind of hypothetical, but say, for example, that we did control, one of these small cities, let's say, Vozhnesk here, northwest of Mykolaiv. So let's say we controlled the highway that goes straight to it, and we get, we punch a big armored thrust, a big armored spearhead here, and then we don't technically control the road. So we didn't peel off any units to control the road on the way, but all the units in between are primarily partisan units or, units that don't have substantial anti-tank, anti-armor capabilities. We could technically just break off a unit and be like, hey guys, we need you to go back down to Mykolaiv, pick up supplies, this or that, or escort more people back up here and come back. So that in and of itself does serve the same purpose. Whereas conversely, let's say you did punch an armored thrust substantially far ahead, but then there were military armed, elements in between there that did have the ability to interdict your armor and things like that, then that's when you actually, are going to get units like, cut off, sectioned off completely. And then kind of, then as far as what I do consider, a controlled city, quote unquote, would be when you can have elements, dismounted elements move into the periphery without facing resistance or substantial resistance, i.e., if we're just going to zoom in here on Mykolaiv, for example. So obviously what the Russians want is they want these, the major highways and stuff like that. But let's say, what I would consider it completely controlled or substantially controlled would be when the Russians can kind of freely operate out in these neighborhoods and things over here without meeting substantial or any real resistance. Whereas if they do kind of control the highway corridor, but as soon as they venture into any of these neighborhoods, they immediately face resistance from whether military units or partisan, militia type of units, then I would not, consider that, an entity or a city rather that we control. So that's kind of what I use for my own data points on that. So if we kind of, this kind of shows again, so coming out of, Mykolaiv, so basically what that means is that the Russians have essentially punched multiple units, up here around, Pervomaisk and Yuzhno-Ukrainsk, however you pronounce this, Yuzhno-Ukrainsk. That is a hell of a word there. But basically what it means is that they've essentially continued out of this corridor, coming from Mykolaiv, and basically punched north on this highway here, running up through, kind of some of these towns, which makes sense. It also makes sense that they don't completely control that area. And then now as we'll work our way back to, to the east here, kind of moving counterclockwise on our map. So as we said before, so the Russians do kind of control all along the Dnieper here, basically over to Melitopol and heavy fighting in Mariupol and Berdyansk. So basically, as we said, the Russians basically control all the way up and along here, and then kind of in a line, this sort of cuts straight across here down to Mariupol. And so as we said, the reason that Mariupol is so important is that, one, it sits on this major highway, this E58, which kind of connects Rostov-on-Don, comes across the Ukrainian border here, and then, connects itself all the way back over with these highways, that come out of Crimea. So being able to link the two axes, so the axes that are coming in the Luhansk and Donetsk area here, and being able to link that into one solid, kind of axis of advance there is very big. The other thing is that Mariupol is it's a coastal city, which means that it has, substantial, access for naval-related assets and things like that, which also means that controlling it more or less eliminates, the Ukrainians being able to use this section of, what we call the Sea of Azov here to conduct additional marine-related, amphibious operations. Because technically speaking, whether they do it or not, as long as the Ukrainians have, amphibious forces and they have a place to launch them, they can do, sort of behind the lines operations, coming out of this area down into Crimea, into Russia proper, things like that. Which in some ways that would mimic, kind of what the Russians did during World War II with, the Germans being, down around Sevastopol, Simferopol, along Feodosia and all these places. But the Russians were still able to use naval forces and kind of land sort of all along, the coast down here, as well as the coast over here, and come across the Kerch Peninsula. And so they were not able to land enough forces to prevent, kind of the inevitable, fall of Sevastopol and the Crimean Peninsula in general. But it took the Germans a long time to take it over completely. One, just because the complex itself is built very substantially, very formidably. But the Russians were able to kind of continually land enough troops to sort of just constantly, sort of be frustrating and just slowing the operations down enough there. So as we said, flashback to our map here again, the Russians do appear to basically control Luhansk and Donetsk areas here, on the kind of the north and the northeast of Mariupol, which would be kind of, coming down through here and on, obviously these major highway sets there. So as we said before, the Russians have units, and they do have presence in Zaporizhia. There's a nuclear power plant there and everything along the Dnieper. So obviously, there's been a fair amount of fighting in Nikopol and other places along there as the Russians are moving north from there. Now they do need to shore this up. So it appears that their main effort currently is in Mariupol, as far as shoring up south there. Once they once they fully shore that up, or if they do fully shore that up, then it'll be kind of a race to then connect and to, assist in getting through Kharkov and then sectioning off what would be essentially this entire eastern nub of Ukraine, essentially everything that's sort of east of the Dnieper here, and then, kind of, run along to, kind of roughly a Kharkov line. So kind of flashback here again, this is kind of another, thorn in the side of the Russians is so the Ukrainians have managed to maintain control of Kharkov proper here. Now, the Russians have, kind of come along some of these highway corridors and, come further south. And I've seen maps that show a substantial amount more control, kind of coming out of the east of, Kharkov here. So kind of, there's so many freaking words when you use Google Maps. I wish you could just shut that stuff off. But, coming down this E40 that runs down through Kramatorsk, I've seen most of the maps show that Kramatorsk down here is also under Russian control. So, kind of obviously, so major highway system running from Kharkov down into the Donetsk and Luhansk areas. And so sectioning this off, and like I said, once they sort of get that, and they can kind of really, basically solidify these separatist areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. So that portion, we assume that's got to be a major idea of the Russians is to, basically either annex these two separatist areas or quote unquote, allow them to be, kind of operate autonomously, which means basically they'd be, Russian puppets. And so them, the Ukrainians still holding Kharkov is a very big deal because what would be substantially worse if and when they manage to take Kharkov or enough of Kharkov that they can, advance down this E105 and advance across this M03 here, towards Poltava and across the Dnieper at Kremenchuk and then down to Dnieper City, which would mean, so obviously if we look at this highway system, so if they can capture Kharkov, there's not much, from a terrain standpoint, that's going to limit them on the eastern side here, which would mean they would basically control everything east of the Dnieper here, which would be very bad. It's also why the fact that the Ukrainians have frustrated them for so long is why there's tons of videos out now. The Russians are basically doing what Russians do, and they're just flattening Kharkov. Indiscriminate bombings of everything, civilian this or that, like launching MLRSs and cluster munitions and all sorts of things at Kharkov. Which is, it's part of the Russian game plan. If you look back to, 1995 in Grozny, in the first Chechen war, that was kind of their go-to. They punched, I think it was 3 or 4 motorized brigades, including the Maiskops Brigade, which was kind of the famous 60 hours of Grozny, where, I think it was like 79% of the Maiskops Brigade got killed or something. It was a ridiculous number. It was like 790 out of the 1,000 people that comprised it all got whacked in Grozny by the Chechens. And not to toot my own horn too much, but immediately, like when the American pullout from Afghanistan was going on, I put a post on my Facebook, just a link to the Wikipedia page for the first Chechen war, and I put on there, anyone who wants to get a head start on next semester's topic, here you go. And then sure enough, we're basically in the first Chechen war, quote unquote, here, but in the Ukraine. So while I try to remain completely and utterly humble, I have hit pretty accurately on a couple of those things. But it does appear, that the Ukrainians are doing a very good job around, Kharkov, and have substantially, dealt with the Russians there, which is a very big deal. Just given the nature of, Kharkov being a good road center here, and like I said, where it sits to being able to control the eastern side of the city. But also, if we kind of look at that, so, control of Kharkov and then control of things like Poltava or Kremenchuk would mean that, the Russians could also immediately move more units across the Dnieper south of Kiev and, continue an additional, encircling of the city there. So flashback to our map here. So up around Sumy. So Sumy's seen a lot of fight. There's a lot of videos and stuff out of Sumy. And so Sumy sits on kind of one major highway corridor here. So the city itself has actually remained pretty well fought over, but you can actually see this highway. Let's see if we can zoom in without getting too many towns popped up. So this highway H07 here that runs from Sumy basically straight to Kiev. So that does, that is more or less under Russian control as far as being able to move units, but the city itself is not entirely under control. So there's still a lot of fighting in and around Sumy, but the Russians do control the enough of the highway corridor there that between that and then their elements here in Chernihiv, directly north of Kiev, they've been able to kind of encircle and or advance on Kiev from the east and north as well. And so Kiev obviously sits right on the Dnieper River here. And then, as we said, the main Kiev effort, initially during the assault, came directly south, out of Belarus, through this area over here. So they bridged the river, whatever that was, basically came down on this highway system here. And then they've been advancing over here. It's why guys who've been following it, you've seen a lot of, like Irpin and Busha and Hostomel and places like that have been in the news a lot for the fighting and things that are going on there. So as the Russians continue to surround and otherwise like set up their operations for what we assume is going to be an assault on Kiev, and they're also substantially increasing their their indirect fire and their supporting fires. They're softening up things on Kiev as far as hitting it with air power, artillery, and multiple launch rocket systems, the MLRSs, things like that. So as we kind of see here, so again, we can kind of see, coming out of here what the general control is and what the general advance for the Russians, coming from Sumy and Chernihiv, and then so you got Gamel here, which is kind of the main hub in Belarus that's sort of supplying this stuff. Then coming down and surrounding Kiev to attack it. So now, apparently there was a meeting of leaders of multiple countries in Kiev yesterday, I believe. And so I guess I'm curious. I don't really know what the level of, mobility is within the city of Kiev currently. And this is one thing I think is difficult. It's still difficult for me, and I've spent my entire life studying war, is like you have to like remember that, just the city of Kiev proper. So if we look at our little scale down here, just the city of Kiev proper is 20 miles from, kind of what's listed as, obviously this whitish gray area on the map. That's 20 miles by 20 miles, which is a pretty substantial distance if you think about it. And this is something like I always kind of have to like take myself back and remember, because you're like, oh, you're just bombarding the city, or you think back to like the carpet bombing attacks in World War II, and you're like, oh, they're just indiscriminately bombing, Berlin or Bremen or whatever. And it's like if you think about what the size of a flight of World War II bombers actually is and the distance it covers, you basically can just pick a neighborhood. So you're basically picking a neighborhood and trying to bomb that. Obviously, we can be more specific and much more accurate now with guided munitions and stuff. But like 20 miles is still, that is a substantial distance to cover in that, which means that like you're going to have certain neighborhoods in Kiev at any given time which are having a substantial amount of fighting, and things are just absolutely getting thrown down. And you're gonna have other parts of the city where like they might not even be able to hear the fighting that well, because again, it'd be 20 miles away. And that's just the city proper. But so you look at some of these other places. So when we're talking about like Hostomel and Busha and Irpin, that's an additional 5 or so miles outside of what's considered the furthest extent of Kiev proper. And so guys, like myself, like I live outside of the Omaha metro area. So the Omaha metro, if I started at the river and drove west on the interstate, it would take me 20 minutes on the interstate to get from one end to the other end. So it's a substantial amount of space, which means that like it takes a lot of people to try to completely surround that. So what you're going to see is that Kiev is probably going to maintain a pretty high amount of civilian and military related mobility inside of it for the most part. It also means that because of that, the Russians are going to go much harder, and they're going to probably switch to a substantial amount of relatively indiscriminate neighborhood bombing and things like that. And I kind of touched on this in my last video, which is when it comes down to like defense in an urban environment, this will be, aside from Grozny, I guess, in 95, this will be kind of the first time that we have a relatively, a modern military versus a modern military in a large, built-up, modern urban environment in which the defenders also retain the ability to inflict catastrophic kills on the enemy's armor. So I can speak with a fair amount of, personal experience / personal expertise on the operations of attacking a fortified, enemy city from my, from my operations in Fallujah in 2004 and early 2005. But we were not dealing with an enemy that had the ability to actually interdict our heavy armor. I guess you could say some of the larger IED, ambushers or the larger, like, pre-placed IEDs, technically speaking, could have. But there basically didn't exist the ability for somebody to pop out of a corner with a javelin or an NLAW and take a shot at an Abrams and have a realistic chance of knocking one out. And then we had, big armored bulldozers as well. So basically speaking, it was kind of up to us to to decide how long or like how much time we wanted to invest in given clearing ops. And they basically could not stop us. Obviously, tanks can only run for, a certain amount of time before they have to go and refuel and rearm and things like that. Whereas Kiev is going to be different. So you're going to have people in the city who can absolutely launch, the most modern of anti-armor weapons and interdict Russian armor, which will be a big deal. Conversely, the Russians are going to show absolutely no compunction for, mitigation of civilian casualties when it comes to their supporting fires. And so it'll be curious to see how it plays out, because as I kind of talked about before, when we talk about like a defense in an urban environment, so the kind of the typical trope is that if you are a defender who is outgunned by the enemy, you need to limit your defensive positions, sectors of fire. Because, like, let's say, for example, if, we'll use Fallujah for an example. So you could set up in, the tallest 6-story building has the best field of view, the best field of fire, put an RPG, team up in the 6th story, put machine gun teams or snipers up there or whatever, have fantastic fields of fire, but we have tanks and armor. So we can shoot you from any distance that you can and much further, and those places are very obvious. So what the enemy did that was the most successful is trying to engage us in places where they had very limited fields of fire, which means conversely, we had very limited fields of fire to engage them as well. So, engaging from, windows and loopholes and things in walls, but not ones that were staring down an entire street. That might stare only at the entrance to another house, kind of things like that. As well as, they need to be knocking holes in walls and, in buildings so they can move freely from room to room without having to expose themselves to additional windows, or freely from building to building without having to cross the street. The other thing about, large avenues of approach and then, corresponding large sectors of fire is that, if an enemy is trying to use mobility in an urban environment, which is it's technically, the right answer, it also means that you have to be very careful, like running across the street to get into the buildings on the other side if the enemy has a tank or a machine gun sitting at the other end, because that's a long avenue of approach. And as anyone who's watched any of my other videos know, that's what machine guns and otherwise supporting arms are primarily watching, or avenues of approach. So, being able to, whether they can tunnel under the road or, knock holes through walls, being able to limit that. But to have any sort of substantial success, the Ukrainian military will have to maintain an organizational level of battle that allows them to use supporting arms like artillery, mortars, things like that, as well as their own armor and their own anti-armor weapons. Like I said, is they could deal a substantial number of casualties and they can frustrate an enemy, but you cannot really defend a city in the, ad infinitum if you just have, 1,000 teams of 4 dudes running around. It's hard, borderline impossible to coordinate. It means that you don't necessarily know where people are. Another thing that comes with that is as the units get smaller and smaller, it becomes more difficult to enforce a certain level of activity amongst people, with a certain, given it a certain level of danger. And what I mean by that is if it's just, let's say we'll go the most extreme example. Let's say it's just me by myself in an urban environment and there's a tank coming down the road and I have some sort of anti-armor weapon. Let's say I've got an RPG 7, right? So I know the correct military response is for me to try to find a way to peek around the corner, shoot at the tank, but that's a substantial amount of risk, right? I don't have any backup. There could be people directly to the side of me who could see me, who could shoot at me, things like that. So people are going to be less prone to initiate the types of engagements where they can be the most successful in causing casualties in the smaller units that they're a part of. Now, conversely, if you operate in too large of units, then all the enemy does is go, hey, I think we saw 40 dudes running that shopping building over there. Can you guys just go drop a bomb on it? They go, yep, cool, no problem. So there's obviously there's a balancing act to that. But I kind of think back to I read something on it about German World War II pilots when they were attacking, like American daylight bombing formations, and they basically said the same thing. When it came to they're kind of like how they would attack the bombers, and what they would do is they would basically have the they would pair the less experienced pilots with the more experienced pilots, and that way the more experienced pilots were the most likely to press the attack to closer ranges, the ranges where they would score more hits per round fired, so their accuracy would go up, but where they could actually dictate an effective attack on an aircraft. Whereas if left by themselves or in too small of units or with too many inexperienced people, they tended to either attack from a very far distance and then pull off, to be safer, which is kind of understandable. Or it wasn't uncommon for planes to have mechanical problems, or they would have a weapons malfunction or something like that. So as they would go to the beginning of the attack, they'd realize, hey, something's wrong, they have to break off. So that wasn't an uncommon thing. It still happens to this day. But they'd notice, the smaller units you have and or the larger composition of less experienced pilots that you would have, the more that those things would happen, whether they'd be engaging from too far of a distance or they would find some quote unquote reason that they weren't able to engage. And I think that that's kind of what we'll see, play out a little bit in Kiev, because that's kind of what was, my experience in Fallujah as well, is that there wasn't any sort of like city level coordination amongst the insurgent groups, obviously. But you would, and even within like given buildings, it's like this block wouldn't be coordinated with that block. They might even be dudes from like a different country, because there were people, I've heard like 11 or 17 different countries they had, insurgents, were kind of verified to have been from, like dead insurgents, at the time. And so, yeah, you can cause a lot of headache for guys having to deal with this building, but it also means that like, if you get us all wrapped up in dealing with this one really awful building, we got casualties taking a long time to kind of deal with, it starts to suck more and more units, more and more people, more and more equipment in. So then the appropriate thing to do would be, as everyone gets kind of sucked in on that, would be to have, okay, who's your supporting elements, have them move around the flank, have them move over to where they can engage the avenues of approach and try to interdict the medevac Humvees or, the resupply Humvees or whatever it is. But they obviously didn't really have that level of coordination, so they tended to have fought a whole bunch of not connected small fights, which for someone who has as much firepower as we have, we are going to win all of them without question. So Ukraine, as they're setting that up, that's something they need to take into account. They do still need to have the operational ability to call in supporting arms, to have individual, like unit supporting unit, kind of, interlocking and overlapping fields of responsibility, the ability to, maneuver, and also especially to conduct local counterattacks. So the nature of urban combat tends to be that you sort of move into the buildings of greatest importance, ones that give you a lot of observation, or a large building that would allow you to, bivouac a company of troops for the night while having a good substantial security, things like that. It also means that while maybe you punched, a quarter mile ahead during the day's fighting, the best place to hold up for the night is actually 100 yards back. So as they pull back, you need to have the ability to coordinate units moving back into those areas and then making the enemy have to fight for them again the next day. So I think those will be things that we see, kind of come to fruition. So it'll be kind of, for me, it'd be just, cool to kind of learn about that and see what it comes. And again, like I said, we'll kind of keep an eye on the Belarus situation, what those explosions were. And I have read, I don't know exactly what they meant, but I had read that there were apparently some behind-the-lines Ukrainian operations against Russians taking place, which this is something I brought up from the beginning, is I wondered why, and this could be just completely my lack of understanding for, the situation on the ground or whatever, but I wondered why the Ukrainians didn't have the sort of long-reaching patrols, the LRPs, the SAS types of patrols and things that were, doing cross-border ops into, Russia itself. There is a substantial, anti-war sentiment in parts of Russia, and from the interviews, like, so obviously Russia does a very good job of controlling the media, and now maybe that also means that these things are taking place. The Russians have just managed to keep it off of the, off of the headlines. But I'd wondered why the Ukrainians weren't across the border doing things like attacking gas stations, grocery stores, just lighting cars on fire in parking lots or other such things, to kind of to try to like really pick at that, political scab, of Russians, remind them of, like, hey, you're not even able to keep this war in the country that you invaded, let alone, keep us out of yours. And, kind of remind them what's going on with stuff like that. Especially now that there's like such a widespread targeting of civilian areas, I kind of wondered why, if or when you're going to see these kind of things, and what one would probably, and in some ways also retaliatory strikes or retaliatory operations, at kind of a smaller individual, or maybe even like a larger unit, operational strategic level on that. But that's, pretty much all I got. Like I said, nothing really huge as far as territorial shifts right now. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.